As the new year begins, the Communists launch an attack against the UN defense line near the 38th parallel. Major pressure is exerted by 4 Chinese corps in the west, where units of General Ridgway's 8th Army withdraw to new positions 18 miles north of Seoul. The fighting flares up at many other points along the front as the Reds, disregarding heavy losses, make some gains but are unable to penetrate the Allied defense cordon. Inchon, the seaport for Seoul, is evacuated. After the fall of the South Korean capital on 4 January, nearby Inchon once again sees her beaches crowded with soldiers, reminiscent of the landing here last September. Now, communist reoccupation is expected within a few hours. Inchon has been isolated by the Chinese advance south through Seoul. Rear Admiral L.A. Thackeray, commanding the naval squadron staging the evacuation, comes ashore to inspect beach operations. Chief difficulty in scheduling the embarkation here is the unusually high tides, which have a 30-foot rise and fall. The points where landing craft can come in vary considerably. When UN troops, spearheaded by the 1st Marines, landed here on 15 September, the approaching end of the Korean War was hailed. For 3 months, the United Nations had been on the defensive. The amphibious landing here was a part of the first major UN offensive, a drive that quickly carried UN forces almost to the Manchurian border. Then the Chinese intervened in what General MacArthur described as a totally new war. The outcome of this new phase in Korea is still in doubt, as UN soldiers here are retracing many hard-won steps back along the roads and sea lanes to Busan. During the evacuation, the United States heavy cruiser Rochester is standing by off Wolme to use its heavy guns in case the Chinese appear before expected. The evacuation is to be completed by midnight. As the landing craft pull away, the island of Wolme stands in the background, patched with snow. Wolme was the beachhead for the first wave of assault boats when the Marines landed at Inchon. As the last troops are withdrawn here, the Chinese, 25 miles inland, are crossing the ice on the Han River and pursuing the 8th Army southward through Yeongdong-po. The last bridge across the Han was destroyed yesterday, and Kimpo Airfield has been evacuated. Another side of the picture in this area is the evacuation of thousands of civilian refugees. The civilians from this section of Korea, which has been in UN hands for some time, appear to be much better clothed and fed than the people evacuated from Hungnam in the east. Many of these refugees are factory and dock workers and their families of the Inchon port area. They crowd the docks waiting for transportation. In this evacuation, there is plenty of transportation available, in addition to UN naval vessels, since Inchon is one of Korea's largest harbors and is home port for many cargo and fishing fleets. Many of these refugees are providing their own transportation. Fishing boats and other civil craft are pressed into service. The fare is 10,000 won, or about $30. The journey to Busan by sea takes about 36 hours. As they march down to the docks, their homes are burned behind them as UN demolition teams go to work on Inchon. These people are carrying very little household equipment, but they are dressed much more warmly than refugees seen along the roads in the interior of Korea. At their departure, the second flight for many of these citizens, Seoul and Inchon are practically depopulated. Red reprisals are expected to be even worse than during the first communist occupation, and many more South Koreans are fleeing now than fled before. As darkness comes, there are only a few fires visible. Then, Inchon is destroyed in the face of the enemy. As dawn breaks over the suburban town of Ascom, debris burns in the deserted streets. This is the site of a former arsenal. Abandoned locomotives have received a final going over from the air. Kimpo Airfield, 12 miles inland, lies in smoking ruin. Ground demolitions, aerial bombardment, and naval shell fire destroy the Inchon port installations. The communists, who are already moving in upon this countryside, will find few facilities they can use. The locks, which once protected Inchon's tidal basin, are typical of this port's devastation. United Nations Army units, veterans of the stiff fighting north of Seoul, pull back through the South Korean capital as the order is given to abandon the city to the advancing Chinese communists. The dead city is left to face its second occupation by the Red aggressors. In orderly fashion, the troops file out of Seoul, from which 5/6 of the civilian population has already fled. South of Seoul, the troops cross the Han River on pontoon bridges, which will be dynamited behind them. In rearguard actions along the rice field dikes, men of the 24th Division protect the carefully planned withdrawal and prevent the Chinese from overrunning our southward moving units. In the shadow of a destroyed trestle, Korean refugees stream across the ice of the frozen Han. 1 million refugees from Seoul alone joined the southward migration, offering a serious problem to United Nations authorities. These tragic victims of the Korean fighting must be cared for in already overcrowded southern refugee centers. Further south, near SUWON, the British Commonwealth forces of the 29th British Brigade move to new defense positions as redeployment is begun following the Seoul evacuation. Even the smallest bridges are prepared for demolition as the rearguard troops move southward. Units of this British Brigade were among the last to leave embattled Seoul. The convoy passes a Russian-made tank knocked out during the UN advance of last year. North of SUWON, U.S. forces, supported by tank units, dig in to fight a delaying action. By holding the Chinese forces at bay from a series of selected defense positions, the 8th Army withdrawal from above Seoul is successfully completed with extraordinary order and precision. By 8 January, the second communist invasion of South Korea is a little over a week old, and UN troops are withdrawing along most of the line. In the center, the important rail and road junction city of Wonju is under heavy attack by Red forces. Loss of Wonju will seriously imperil the main United Nations southward withdrawal route. To the west, units of the Allied 8th Army fall back from SUWON before stiff pressure by Chinese divisions. The United States Far East Air Force, going into its 6th continuous day of intensive combat effort, is forced to curtail its activity somewhat because of low ceilings and snow. South Korean recruits, newly inducted into the United Nations forces, embark at Inchon Harbor for basic training centers at Busan and other points in southern Korea. 8,400 inductees, mobilized in the Seoul area, are being transferred to southern training installations as the UN forces prepare to withdraw from the South Korean capital city. These often small but sturdy fighters are a welcome addition to the UN Army ranks because of their knowledge of the Korean terrain and their ability to withstand the harsh climate of their homeland. In the South, they will be given American uniforms and trained in the use of American military equipment. When ready for combat, they will be sent to Republic of Korea units or integrated into other United Nations forces. Strict screening measures keep possible communist sympathizers from enlisting. Many of these recruits remained in Seoul during the first communist occupation, but faced with the prospect of Chinese Red domination, they choose to fight on the side of the United Nations. Although paid the rather uninspiring sum of $2 a month in American exchange equivalent, they will be better fed and clothed than the majority of South Korean civilians. South Korean youths who have heeded the call to arms and joined up to fight for the freedom of their young republic board ships at Inchon on their way south to learn soldiering under the guidance of UN Army instructors. A cargo plane comes in across the bay to land at the Busan airfield in southern Korea. Recently given the name of Unityville, the airfield, nestled between the sea and the hills, serves as a base of combined operations for many of the countries fighting in Korea under the UN banner. As the United Nations Korean airfields dwindle in number, the long runways at Busan are becoming increasingly important for fighter and cargo operations. Here an F-51 of the Australian Air Force is readied for a combat mission. Once the only airstrip held by the UN Air Forces in Korea, the field has again become a bustling air terminal. Tons of cargo and mail come in daily by air and sea for transshipment to the fighting front in planes of the Combat Cargo Command. Side by side with the supply activity, combat units carry out their daily operations against the communists in the north. Napalm firebombs and 50 caliber machine gun rounds are loaded aboard an Australian Mustang of the 35th Fighter Wing. U.S. Marine pilots flying sleek Panther jets under the operational control of the 5th Air Force also take off from the busy Busan Strip on combat assignments. F-51 Mustangs, top fighter planes of World War II, get wing rockets for use against enemy tanks and vehicles. From the Busan base, the fighter bombers range northward, seeking Red troops and supply concentrations. The Mustangs are utilized mainly for direct support missions and interdiction sorties. With its nose in a pool of fomite, an F-51 lies on the Busan field after a crash landing. The force of the crash wrecked the aircraft, but the pilot suffered only a severe jolting. The crack-up is quickly cleared off the field by emergency units. This airfield was almost deserted when the United Nations advance was approaching the Yalu River, as Kimpo and other northern strips took over the bulk of the cargo and fighter plane traffic. Now, Unityville is the busiest UN airport on the Korean Peninsula. A Mustang pilot starts out for an armed reconnaissance patrol. With many large ground force camps in the vicinity, the Busan field is also a center for passenger traffic as personnel of many nationalities move to and from the war zone. At Unityville, United Nations countries banded together in defense of freedom carry out combined operations in a stirring atmosphere of international cooperation. At the Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, B-47 Stratojet light bombers go into quantity production as President Truman sets 50,000 planes a year as the goal for United States plane manufacturers. Concurrently, Air Force plans are announced that will expand the nation's youngest defense service to between 95 and 100 groups. A total strength of nearly 1 million airmen and officers will be needed for this enlarged program. Typical of the modern equipment which will be flown in the expanded Air Force is the B-47 Stratojet bomber being assembled here in this Boeing plant. These 6-engine jet bombers, rated in the 600-mile-an-hour class, are capable of delivering a load of over 10 tons of bombs to enemy targets within a 1,000-mile radius. Recently, a B-47 completed a west-to-east crossing of the United States at an average ground speed of 607 miles per hour. This bomber has a wingspan of 116 feet. It is 107.5 feet long and 28 feet high. The powerful plane, which has a maximum gross takeoff weight of 185,000 pounds, can penetrate the stratosphere to an altitude of over 40,000 feet. Emergency ejection facilities make bailouts possible at high speeds. A girl works on one of the planes that will carry a 3-man crew in pressurized and refrigerated compartments. The General Electric jet engines are rated at 5,200 pounds of thrust for takeoff. The high-wing bomber is also equipped to carry 18 RATO units, which give an additional 20,000 pounds of thrust for takeoff from short runways. The plane's wing, following recent design trends, is swept back 35 degrees. Here, a test crew talks with the unit commander before takeoff. Present plans call for the activation of 2 B-47 groups. Perhaps the most radical innovation in the B-47 is the landing gear of double wheels fore and aft under the fuselage and 2 outrigger struts, one under each wing. Here, the novel landing gear can be clearly seen. The 6 jet engines are mounted in 2 underslung double pods inboard and a single nacelle under each wingtip. As it comes in for a landing, the bomber releases a restraining parachute to reduce its momentum. First flown in 1947 in a test model, the B-47 is slated for an important role in the Air Force's new expansion program. On 22 January, after a week's lull in the heavy fighting, the major offensive for which the communist forces apparently have been massing appears to be getting underway, with short clashes between small units reported at several points. Southeast of Seoul, UN troops are forced to withdraw from Inchon after a 12-hour attack by a reinforced company of the Chinese Communist 42nd Army. Aggressive patrolling by 8th Army units continues in the Wonju area, although Red forces command the heights overlooking the town. In the east, there is minor action at Inchon and Yongwol, with patrol clashes at Gangneung. In the air, 41 Russian-designed MiG jets give battle to United Nations fighter bombers in 5 separate actions. American F-84 Thunderjets destroy one MiG and damage another. No United Nations planes are reported lost.